Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and we're going to get back into Alien Kittens again, just when you thought it was safe to be not listening to Chris's music. But there's a reason. That's because this track, Mr. Thumpy Electronic here, this track is a good example of what we can do with ToVinyl, and that's the plugin I'm showing you today, because Alien Kittens has weird stereo bass. ToVinyl is a plugin that does a number of things like what you would use in vinyl mastering. Most notably, it has an independent side pass for the mid and the side channel, the high pass. What you do with that is raise the high pass on the side channel so that the bass is mono. And this works better for mastering records because a record works kind of like this. It's flat, and the I'll use this so I don't draw on my notes for how to use a synthesizer. Bass on a record in phase goes like this. Vinyl records are made so that the signal, if it was mono, will go side to side. Bass, if it was out of phase, goes up and down like this, and you can't have too much of that. You'll be digging too deeply into the record, or you'll be flying out of the record entirely, and it just doesn't work. So using a high pass on the side channel means that your low frequencies are going to be confined to the plane of the record, and that's how they normally are supposed to be. There's also a use for if you're doing big PA systems and things, because stereo bass over big PAs is pretty much useless. It'll cancel out and just be sort of confusing and muddy, and in general, the lower the frequencies are, the more you're going to want the bass to be mono, because anything in stereo is just going to, be pushing from one speaker, pulling from the other. It accomplishes nothing and burns a lot of extra energy out of your amplifiers. So this is why you would be wanting stereo bass to turn into mono bass. And that works kind of like this. If it's a stereo bass, see the correlation meter is wandering way down over to like 0. The low frequencies are doing that. The high frequencies aren't loud enough to do that very much. But if we turn on ToVinyl, and note we've got some other things in here I'll show you later. Let's put the side high pass way up. Rip. All of a sudden, our entire bass is purely and totally mono, and it shows in this correlation meter down here. Now, you might not want to be crossing over at 300 Hertz, so here's what happens when you're a little higher than that. We'll go to, say, 40 Hertz or so. And it's flattening things out a bit, or we could push it a little farther. Note we also have a mid-high pass, and we can use that as well. That might tighten up the low end a little bit, like if our kick drum or something is wandering. You can get a tone with that, and that'll tighten the impacts a little bit. If you're doing loudness maximizing, that might be a good way to do it. It'll restrain some of the low frequency swings a bit. Then we also have these other controls here. I'll put this down to something limited. High frequency limiter is a very sophisticated way of stepping on the highs. And we can kind of see it in the, maybe I can fiddle with span to do this. this way, and let's make the slope show off our highs a little more. Now we'll turn these things off, and if we turn this on, we don't see any effect, but if we start cranking out the high frequency limiter, look what happens. It's really stomping on the transients very hard. And this is in line with a kind of processing that you use in vinyl mastering, an acceleration limiter that prevents sudden movements of the stylus. This is also part of how you get a record style sound. Like I can easily demonstrate the difference between this and this. I actually have another one that can demonstrate stuff like this too, a stealth kit jam. Very bright here, but then if we turn the HF limiter on, we can restrict it a huge amount. And then if we're turning this down, you can limit it real nicely. Or just stomp it out completely. Let's go back over to Alien Kit. See, very bright. To very stepped on. To completely splatted. But that's not all. The HF limiter in ToVinyl4 is really good. I'm thinking people are going to be able to make use of that. There's this one other thing. If you were using this to make actual vinyl records, don't use the GrooveWare feature. This is the one thing in ToVinyl4 that makes it a little bit more like you were playing back off of a record. And I'll show you how that works. We'll take HF limiter out so that it's not having a big effect. The high passes are still a little bit engaged, but not much. Check this out. GrooveWare is following the path of the signal and trying to add a kind of inertia to the sound. It is causing the highs to not swerve too suddenly and rounding stuff off, so it gets a kind of a dirty sound. And we're making the hats and things sound a little grungy that way. Or, and we can really see that. Let's adjust this a little bit more. So we're not seeing that much in the highs here. Let's find one that does. Oh goodness, yes. So you can see how bright the highs are here. And again, we can smush them out using the HF limiter if we want. But suppose we throw GrooveWare on. Check out what happens here. Actually, that's interesting. What we've got is a situation where it's changing the character of the extreme highs. I know what I can do to demonstrate this better. Here, let's spotlight them. I can put on it's airwindows and slew only. Slew only is here. And if we turn this on, what we get is we're monitoring only the highs. We'll stick that over here for the moment, and now you can hear what that's doing, but then if we turn on slew only, there's the highs alone. Hear what it's doing? The GrooveWare feature in ToVinyl4 can cause it to kind of grunge up the highs as if it was being played back off a record. And you can combine this with other things to just add that flavor to stuff. Or indeed, we can demonstrate the high frequency limiter. You can hear how that is. Let's roll this back. Super highs, and we start affecting it. We start stepping on the brightest peaks there. Then GrooveWare or both. That's ToVinyl4. You got a high pass on the mid and the high pass on the side. The high pass on the side is what you're going to do to elliptical EQ to make the bass be more mono. Your high frequency limiter is for subtly and gracefully cutting back highs. And then GrooveWare gives us sort of grungy analog quality that changes the character and color of the highs. And this is not what you'd necessarily want to do going to actual vinyl. The high passes and the limiter in ToVinyl4 are, I think, acceptable. I mean, there certainly is. I've known people to use Spitfish for high frequency or acceleration limiting in mastering, and this is at least as good as Spitfish, seriously. But you wouldn't want to use GrooveWare necessarily going to an actual record, because the needle in the record actually already does that. But, you know, if you're doing it in digital, you got carte blanche and could do whatever you want. And, I mean, who am I to say? Maybe if you want to have your record have a taste of this quality, like, let's throw bits of back on again, and if you're doing this and you're trying to tone back the highs, and it's interesting because we've got really big peaks here, but we can make the high step on this so hard that it smooths it out and it becomes just straight through to the extremes. In fact, we can even see where it kicks in there. This is where it starts to affect it. And then GrooveWare So if you can get the behavior that you want out of some combination of these, whether it's this clean one or the slight additional fuzz that you get out of the GrooveWare being in there, basically whatever works. These are built to do as much as they can in these areas, but you know, if it sounds right to you and it's working in your situation, then go for it. Put Grooveware on your records that haven't been even played yet if you want. Knock yourself out. You'll be able to know whether the tone is doing what you want. Grooveware adds this sort of scuff and texture to things. And who's to say that's not what you need? ToVinyl4 originally was a plugin that was being sold for $50, or the earlier version of it was. And ToVinyl4 is free because it's supported by Patreon like all my other plugins. So if you find it absolutely, utterly indispensable and you're using all of my other 50 plugins, please pledge to the Patreon to the tune of like $1 a year. That's about $50 a year if they were being sold commercially. And with that kind of support, I could do all kinds of stuff. But this is pretty well taken care of. ToVinyl4 is free to download and use, and I hope that you like it.